Welcome to the Leading Generations podcast from Antioch Bible Baptist Church in Gladstone, Missouri. Each week, Pastor Steve Doss shares an encouraging word on faith, family, or culture as we seek to live out our mission of leading generations to make disciples of Jesus Christ everywhere.
Welcome to episode 10 of the Leading Generations podcast. Our goal for this podcast is to help our church family live out its mission of leading generations to make disciples of Jesus Christ everywhere. Since it's the second Wednesday of the month, we'll focus our attention on the family. Today, I want to look at marriage. Let me start by asking you this question. Whether you're single or married, I want you to think about this question and what your answer would be. What is marriage all about? Let me say it again. What is marriage all about? Maybe you're thinking marriage is about love or happiness, procreation, social status, identity, or partnership. Although none of these are bad things to associate with marriage, I want to challenge you to think at a higher level about what marriage is all about. Our marriages are about more than just love. They're about more than just happiness or procreation or partnership. Marriage is all about God. Let me say that again. Marriage is all about God. If you're like me, you probably didn't quote Psalms 34:3 to your wife when you ask her to marry you. Oh, magnify the Lord with me and let us exalt his name together, right? But that's really the heart of what marriage should be about. It's about God. It's about magnifying the name of the Lord together. When I asked Ruth to marry me, I sent her on a little scavenger hunt. And I had taken a picture from our sports banquet that we were at. She played volleyball, I played basketball. And so we were at the sports banquet together. And so we dressed up fancy. And we had done this a few years earlier. And so I took this picture that we had from the sports banquet and I put it on some foam board. And then I cut the foam board into 4 pieces. And at each spot that she stopped, there was a dozen roses, a part of this picture with the reason I loved her, and a note to tell her where to go to the next stop. And then, of course, at the last stop, there wasn't another piece of the picture. It was me, and I came out and asked her to marry me. It was fun to plan it out, and it was fun to do it. A funny story with this is I had some help with it. I've asked a few people to help me with it, obviously getting stuff where it was supposed to go. And one of her stops was at the church that we went together, and I'd put together a slideshow or a PowerPoint presentation that she was to come in and sit down, and our favorite song was playing with pictures going. And I'd asked one of my friends to follow her to each one of these spots and take pictures of it. And this is before we had phones where we could use our phones to take pictures. You have to actually have a camera. And so I'd ask one of my friends to do this. And he went through the whole time with this camera and was thinking he was taking pictures, but then found out that his camera, and I don't know how this happened, but he found out his camera batteries were dead. So he didn't get one picture from that whole scavenger hunt thing of Ruth opening her cards and seeing the roses. I'm telling you, it's been 22 years of marriage, and I still think I'm a little bitter about the reality that my friend didn't get those pictures. I don't think it's affected our marriage too much, but it still just bothers me to this day because I'd planned it. That's what I wanted to happen, was to see her reaction at each one of those spots because I was ahead of it. But just a sort of a fun side story. But at those spots, I didn't have that verse there for her, like, let us magnify the Lord together. But that really is the purpose for marriage. The purpose for marriage is God. That should be the heart of our marriage. It is the purpose behind our marriage. Let me give you a couple verses to consider for the reason why I would say that the purpose for marriage is God. In Genesis 1:27 and 28, when marriage was created, God said this, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So God created man and woman, and he put them together, and he said, procreate, right? Fill the earth, but also rule over the earth. In Genesis chapter 2, we get to see a little glimpse behind the curtain, how God made woman and how he took it from the rib of Adam. He took a rib from Adam and made woman from that rib. And after he's done that and he presents the woman to Adam, Adam says that it says this, that the Lord took the rib and taken from the man, he made the woman and brought it to the man. And the man said, "This is his last, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of the man." And then it says this, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." We see in these verses that God is the creator of marriage. Therefore, marriage is all about him. Another verse to consider is Colossians 1:15 through 17, where it says this, that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. If we want to know what God is like, we look at Jesus. He is the firstborn of all creation. And then it says this about Jesus, "For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together." Did you hear that? All things were created through Jesus and for Jesus. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Marriage is all about God. The purpose of marriage is God. When we understand that the purpose of marriage is to glorify God, the purpose of marriage is God, it adds value to your marriage. Marriage becomes more than just two people enjoying life together. And it's a good thing, but it adds value. It makes it more than just two people enjoying life together. For a while, our family liked to watch the show called Shark Tank. And the point of this show is an entrepreneur comes on the show and pitches their product to a group of wealthy businessmen and women, and then they ask them to invest in their product. And if the shark chooses to invest in them, the value of their product immediately goes through the roof. Why? Because of the value that the wealthy businessman or woman brings to the table. And this is what I mean by understanding the purpose of our marriage being God. It sends the value of our marriage through the roof, right? The God who is infinite and eternal, wise, all-powerful, holy, just, good, loving, all-knowing spirit, the maker and supreme ruler of heaven and earth, right? Our statement of faith about God our Father. This God says to us, marriage is about me. I'm putting my name on the line through your marriage. This adds so much value to our marriages. You are representing God through your marriage. It adds value to it. When we understand that the purpose of marriage is to glorify God, the purpose of marriage is God, it not only adds value, I would say it adds weight to our marriage. In our culture, marriage tends to be something we can take or leave even after we get married. You have this idea of cohabitation where people live together to sort of test drive marriage to see if it works for them. Several years ago, there was an article titled, "Is Marriage Becoming Irrelevant?" The point of the article was to show the stats that people were beginning to think that marriage is really not that big a deal, especially if you have kids. But God has a different word, right, to say about marriage. Because marriage is all about Him, marriage never becomes irrelevant here on earth. Because the purpose of marriage is God. The purpose of marriage is to glorify God. Now, I tell you this, but there is a day when marriage will not exist. In Matthew chapter 22, Jesus is asked about a hypothetical widow who continues to get remarried and whose husband she will be in heaven. And I think the story goes she was married 7 times. And Jesus responds by saying, in the resurrection, there will be neither married nor given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. This comes from Matthew chapter 22 and verse 30. Now, this may seem discouraging, right? Like, well, so marriage won't be in heaven. We won't be married in heaven. And doesn't that seem like that would take away the value of marriage, take away the weight of marriage? But I would say to you, it actually does the exact opposite of that. It adds the value to it and it adds weight to it. Why? Because we got one shot at this gift called marriage. There are no second chances. And so the idea is let's make the most of it. More importantly, it adds weight to our relationship with God because it is the thing that will last beyond this life, that will last beyond even our marriage. But I think about this, it's not only true of me and as the husband, but it's true of my wife as well, that the most important thing about her is her relationship with God, right? And so it adds weight to this marriage that we have together that it although won't last forever, we have this brief moment in time where we can both glorify God, we can make much of God by being married. And by the way, let me say this. If marriage is not going to be in heaven, it means our relationships are going to be so much better than they are here on earth. That we won't need this type of relationship there. We are not going to be less fulfilled in heaven than we are here on earth. So it adds weight to it to understand that the purpose of marriage is God. The purpose of marriage is to glorify God. When you understand that the purpose of marriage is to glorify God, it not only adds value and weight, but it also prioritizes God above my marriage. The focus of marriage is God, and marriage is a gift that God has given me and you to use to magnify Him. It goes back to Psalms 34 and verse 3. Although maybe we didn't use this when we ask our wife to marry you, it's a great verse to remind us of the priority of our marriage. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt His name together. In our pastoral team, we do premarital counseling with those that we marry, and we like to take them through a book called Tying the Knot. And I like how that book puts it. And one of the reasons we love the book is because it talks a lot about Christ being the center of your life. And if Christ is the center of your life and your marriage, then everything flows properly from that. So it's Christ is the center of your life. And then it talks about communication. Christ is the center of your life, conflict. But he says this in chapter 1, when you love Jesus, you are the most prepared to love your spouse. When you love Jesus, you are most prepared to love your spouse. In your marriage, the priority relationship is God, because that's the purpose of marriage. And when you love Jesus, when you love God, you'll be most prepared to love your spouse. He says also in that book, and I love this thought, that Jesus is your spouse's hero. Jesus is your spouse's here. Again, it's just keeping that focus of God and glorifying God through your marriage. When Jesus is the center of your marriage, everything else in your marriage will begin to work itself out. It'll begin to work in the way that God designed it to work. Francis Chan, in his book, You and Me Forever, Marriage in Light of Eternity, says it this way: most marriage problems are not really marriage problems, they're God problems. Most marriage problems are not marriage problems, he says, they're God problems. He is saying most of our problems in marriage stem from our relationship with God, not our spouse. If your goal is to have a marriage that pleases you, every problem is an opportunity for you to win. But if you see the purpose and the goal of your marriage is God and to glorify God, then every problem will be an opportunity to glorify God because He is the priority, not necessarily fixing the problem or fixing your marriage. You see those difficulties and those troubles that you're going through as an opportunity to glorify God, the opportunity to strengthen your relationship with God. I thought about Galatians chapter 5, verses 19 through 23, that talks about the works of the flesh. And oftentimes in our marriage conflicts, right, we see these works of the flesh come out. It talks about anger and dissension, division, envy. Those kind of things work themselves out in our marriage. And he talks about how we shouldn't walk in those things, but we should walk in the Spirit, and the fruit of the Spirit will become evident in our lives. And it's this love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and gentleness and self-control. And so when we understand that our marriage is to glorify God, it prioritizes that relationship with God. And so those fruits of the Spirit will become evident, especially in moments of conflict. And so if I'm having an issue in my marriage, maybe I need to not go back to my spouse, but I need to go back to my relationship with God and see if there's any area of my life where I've not given it over to the Lord, that I'm not exhibiting these fruits of the Spirit. And that's what I think Francis Chan is after when he says most of our problems are God problems, is that we're not seeing God as the priority relationship. Rather, we're elevating marriage above God. Finally, when you understand the purpose of marriage is to glorify God, it highlights the gospel. Tim Keller, in his book, The Meaning of Marriage, says that the secret to marriage is found in the gospel. And I like how Tim describes the gospel. He says, the gospel is this: we are more sinful and flawed in ourselves than we ever dared believed, yet at the very same time, we are more loved than we dared hoped. Marriage is the coming together of two sinners. Sinners that are going to let each other down. Sinners that are going to sin against each other. But when those two sinners forgive each other, they are highlighting the gospel. Ephesians 4:32 says, we forgive one another as Christ forgave you. This is the gospel, that we understand that we are more sinful than we could ever imagine, yet at the same time, we are more loved than we ever dared hoped for. This is the gospel. We sinned against a holy God, Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And because we sin, there's a penalty to pay. Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. But God sent his son Jesus to pay the price for our sins. Romans 5:8, God demonstrated his love towards us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And we can be forgiven of our sins by believing that Jesus died and was buried and rose again. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. This is the good news of the gospel. And when a couple lives out the gospel, they are highlighting the word. They are making much of Jesus. They are showing what it means for Christ to have a relationship with his church. That's why in Scripture, Jesus is referred to as the groom and the church is referred to as the bride, because marriage highlights the gospel. So let me go back to the question I started with. What is marriage all about? The answer is God. Marriage is all about God. Marriage is all about glorifying God. Understanding this truth brings clarity to a lot of other things about marriage, like communication, conflict, sex, and so much more. It brings clarity because your starting point is right. Have you ever tried to put something together and started with the wrong piece? I swear every time that I put something together, this happens to me, especially with IKEA furniture, right? Where they make it where you can't see any of the screws or the holes, right? You're putting it all together like that. And it always seems like I'll get halfway through and realize that the first piece that I started with, I had it the wrong way, right? Or I put it in the wrong side. And it's so frustrating to me. And many marriages live in constant frustration because you have the first piece of your marriage wrong. And that is the purpose of marriage. The purpose of marriage is to glorify God. The purpose of marriage is God. And when you and I understand that, when we get the first piece right, it'll help us in our communication. It'll help us in our conflict. It will help us in our finances. But we got to get that first piece right. So in this first time in our Leading Generations podcast to talk about marriage, I wanted to make sure to start with the purpose of marriage, because we'll get into communication, we'll get into conflict and some of these other aspects of marriage. But if we don't have the first piece right, then my concern is that everything else will not work according to plan. So thanks for joining me today. I hope this episode will help you, whether you're thinking about getting married or you've been married for a lot of years, that it'll help you be reminded of the purpose of marriage being God, to glorify God. If we get that right, everything else will begin to fall into place. I love you, church family. Let's continue to live out our mission of leading generations to make disciples of Jesus Christ everywhere. See you next time.